But it's actually Titan, the largest moon of Saturn.
Okay.
Uh, that's something that I've been working on with a group of people recently. Is a
Yeah.
sample return mission from Titan, and the reason that Titan's so interesting is it's very reminiscent of like kind of like a primordial Earth, sort of like an older Earth prior to a lot of the life forms. Like there are large scale mountain ranges and huge lakes and whatnot. The only caveat being that these lakes are not water; they're methane and ethane.
Yes.
But it has a water cycle, really a methane ethane cycle, where it rains. It like all the water on the planet is
Mm-hmm.
essentially stone because it's just really really hard ice because it's colder there and the atmosphere is really dense. But it's super interesting because there's tectonic shifts. There's this planet is very very active,
Hmm.
uh, but if something were to live there, it would operate completely different than anything that we would know because they probably would be carbon-based life forms still, maybe because methane and ethane and whatnot. But the fact that there's no liquid water and it's all like the way that life on our planet works is essentially that water is like our life source. If something were to live there, it would have to use methane and ethane as a life source, which would mean their biology would be completely different. Even if they're microorganisms, they would have to survive in probably a different way than they would here. So it's
Yeah.
very interesting. And the concept of the mission is to take some of the soil at like very specific sites and stuff where they think that there's a lot of activity and then take it back to Earth. Um, so that's actually something that I've been working on recently, and it's super cool. And that is one of the moons in the solar system that is very interesting for astrobiology.
Wow. So, Zach, if that is the case which you are telling us, then how are you looking at the possibility of actually the future in which it will be quite possible for most of us to go into a planet and then come up with ideas and implement them with alien like species, like actual interaction with aliens on a human per like level. Also my you like it can be microbes level kind of an interaction, like we might encounter an alien cell in some planet. Like what is your probable idea on this thing?
I personally think so. I 100% think that there's alien life out there. I know some people disagree, but I think the universe is too big to not have, no matter how small the chances of life forming. I think that because the universe is basically infinite and we can't even see like far enough out to get a good hold on what's actually happening out there, there has to be some sort of life out there, especially intelligent life may be a little bit further out, something that we can't really interact with for quite some time. But I think that there's honestly a possibility that even in our solar system, there's some sort of microorganisms that exist, which would also it still hits that threshold of being some alien life form, which would throw off the concept that there isn't any alien life out there, because then we'd know that there's at least something small in our own solar system. And that alone, I think, should give people more credence on the possibility that there's intelligent life out there somewhere. Um, However, I'm personally not too confident right now that we'll be like interacting with some crazy alien species like in Star Trek or Star Wars or something, because I think that space is the same way that space is so big that there has to be some type of life out there. Space is so big that it's very likely we can't contact or see them at a, like anytime soon based with our current technology, but fingers crossed.
Exactly, Zach. So, if that is the possible case, how are you planning actually?
Yeah, the audio is fine. So I actually think that it's a good thing that there's a lot of private companies popping up. I think that um, government agencies and private companies both have a role to play in the future of space travel, and I think they do their specific roles very well. So obviously, previously, every country's like space agency would do everything from research to building the rockets to uh, sending stuff up. Like they had to deal with every aspect of the space mission essentially. With private companies coming up and showing that they're actually feasible structures for a company and they make money off of it and everything. Um, they're not only are they innovating because they're competing with each other and everything, obviously. I know Blue Origin and SpaceX have kind of a rivalry going, but stuff like already reusable rockets is something that came out of private companies, like because they were trying to cut down on costs and whatnot, to try to use the same rocket a couple times, and just this idea that uh, these innovations can come about through competition, as well as that the way they manufacture these rockets is getting cheaper and cheaper because they're trying to make money off of it. Whereas with NASA and um, Japanese Space Agency, Indian Space Agency, all that stuff, like I can only imagine. I only have experience with NASA, obviously, but I can only imagine with all of that, it tends to get inflated throughout the process when you're building things through the government. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just I think that the role that private companies have to play in the future of space travel is essentially everything from low Earth orbit and below. So all the launch vehicles and stuff like that, I think are going to be primarily, if not entirely, made by private companies, especially coming up. I know NASA does have the Space Launch System in process of being built, which is a launch system, obviously, based on the name, but that was in the process of being made for quite some time. And I think they were still building it throughout like the early stages of these companies. But now, and it is insanely huge and has so much energy that you can throw stuff off the planet with. But after SLS, I don't see NASA trying very hard to come up with their own launch systems again. I think that they're going to kind of either use what SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic have, or kind of commission them to make something a little bit more powerful if they need it. And then that way, the government agencies can focus more on deep space stuff and research. And I think just that alone and having all of the funds for these government agencies allocated towards those like large scale problems and stuff rather than the actual manufacturing, I think that it's going to end up speeding up a lot of research and missions and timelines for when we're actually launching things. So I think it's a good thing. Um, so can you give like an example of questions you're looking for, I guess? So you want questions specifically for like okay, well I guess I could just I threw out the term moon to Mars before, so I guess just a general question of like asking people what they think or what they know about the actual moon to Mars mission and like why we're going back to the moon, what the general moon to Mars timeline is and whatnot, because that is something big that's going on. Okay. um, well, first off, I would love to say that I'm ecstatic to see all these people watching. I love to see that. And I'm glad they're all interested in space and science, because they're going to be the future. um, yeah, so there are three main reasons for the Moon to Mars mission, like for why we're going back to the moon first. Um, I don't know how you want to do this. If you want me to just say what the three main things are, or okay, yeah. So in that case, then I'll list what the three main objectives are then, and then we can discuss like what they think about each of them. uh, so the like the number one reason is essentially we've been on the moon before, right? So a lot of people are like, why are we going back? Blah, blah, blah. The idea is instead of just going and sending people to the moon for a day, like a couple hours or whatever, and coming back, um, it's the idea of essentially not entirely setting up like a moon base, but a sustained presence of people kind of cycling through and going to the moon, performing like building up structures to perform experiments and whatnot in low gravity environment without an atmosphere and whatnot. So essentially, kind of like a smaller, more confined international space station to an extent, but on the moon. So this idea of a sustained presence of people constantly going there, just like people constantly go to the space station to perform experiments, that gives us another option. It's something that we don't have to entirely like constantly perform maintenance on, like the space station is entirely man-made. Um, and it also gives us the opportunity, obviously, to kind of perform experiments on lunar soil, like the actual lunar soil, instead of just like simulated lunar soil and whatnot. And possibly, I don't want to invoke space mining because there's really not that much on the moon other than like tritium and stuff, but that's not really useful because we don't have any fusion reactors. um, but the second main purpose of going to the moon first before Mars is uh, essentially testing things and proof of concept of a lot of new technologies for radiation shielding, the way that they have astronauts essentially work on their spacecraft so that they don't get muscle atrophy or have bone issues and whatnot. So it's essentially uh, a demonstration of modern safety aspects prior to this 8 month trip out to Mars, where they're going to have to stay there for 2 more months and then have 8 months back. Like the Mars mission is going to be a little under 2 years long in total. So the idea is that we need to be sure that everything is going to be okay with these astronauts when we send them out there. So by sending things out similar to what we're sending out to the moon or to the Mars, and we send it to the moon first with people, it's a very easy way to kind of say, okay, this definitely is working. So I think we're safe to send things to Mars. And then the final aspect of this moon to Mars trip is previously the only people to have walked on the moon were people who are now old white men, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, but the idea is kind of diversify a little bit. So have the first woman and first person of color walk on the moon as well. That way we can kind of, and it's an easier way to integrate everybody together and be like, hey, this is humanity's success. It's all of us doing this together. So, um, as far as stuff I've worked on, because I have done quite a few things with the Moon to Mars mission, and a lot of my stuff, I was more on the moon side of this. Um, so a lot of my stuff was obviously trajectory planning, but specifically um, two separate things. One was abort scenarios. So like if for some reason we needed to get off the moon immediately, like what is the window that we can do that and stuff. That's something that I had worked on. Kind of just like, okay, send it up. And then the idea at the time was to have like a mini space station orbiting the moon as well that we can kind of uh, interlock with and whatnot to keep the astronauts safe if they needed to get off the moon. But I don't believe that's still happening. However, the other main trajectory piece that I worked on, which is really cool, and I didn't come up with it, I just worked a lot with it. It's something called NRHOs, which are near rectilinear halo orbits, which are very bizarre. They're essentially, so normally you think of um, orbits being essentially planar, so 2D really, 2D in 3D space essentially. Uh, but NRHOs are they're in 3D space, and they are like they utilize like all three dimensions essentially, because they start looking like sort of a regular ovular orbit, but then they kind of peak up like out of the z-axis a little bit at the end and then go like around and then back down. There's some weird space magic going on. Not actually, but it's a very cool orbit. I think it was initially discovered slash designed by someone out of Purdue, um, who now works for NASA, or through a contractor. I can't remember if she's a contractor or for the government, but regardless, that's super cool, and it's super fun to work with. It's actually kind of difficult to work with because it's a little bit unstable compared to some of the. It's not an unstable orbit, but compared to some of the more traditional like 2D orbits that are pretty straightforward. It's a little iffier to kind of like, okay, if I do this, what's going to happen, sort of thing. Um, but then, as far as stuff in general, for what I'm most excited about with the moon is that sustained presence portion of what I was talking about. Just the idea that there's at any given time, in like a few years or something, you can look up at the moon and be like, oh man, there's people on there right now. Like just that idea of looking up at like the night sky and seeing, oh my God, there's people up there doing science experiments and stuff like that. That's absolutely crazy. Uh, I'm vaguely aware of what you're talking about. That was with like the whole Planet X stuff or whatever. I think where it was like, oh, there's some other planet in the solar system that's on impact with us that we haven't seen yet. Um, I don't particularly hold it in such high regard as a theory. It's a really cool idea, terrifying but cool. And I mean, there are plenty of things out there, even in our own solar system, that we barely see before like something would be able to happen. Essentially, um, but I don't particularly put too much weight on an entire Mars-sized planet colliding with us. I would believe stuff more like asteroids or something coming out of the solar system on like a highly elliptical trajectory, so they end up going super fast once they enter our solar system. Stuff like that can happen relatively easily, and at the point where by the time we'd know, there would be not much we could do about it. So you kind of just gotta hope for the best. You gotta hope that like either Jupiter, which is basically the vacuum cleaner of the solar system, kind of like sucks it up with its giant gravity well, or uh, it's small enough to burn up mostly in the atmosphere or something like that, or maybe happens to collide with another planet. Because as much as I would hate for any of the planets to get screwed up, I'm a little bit partial towards Earth staying alive. You can't learn about other planets if we die. So I mean, I wouldn't really say it's my theory, obviously. I mean, I've always subscribed to like the different iterations of the Big Bang theory and whatnot for actual creation of the universe and everything, and then just the idea that throughout that essentially that expansive, vast like distance, you end up getting these clusters because obviously gravity is still a thing, even on like smaller objects and stuff still produce gravity. It's just because they're so small and the mass is so small, they don't actually you can ignore it essentially. Like your car keys technically have a gravitational force, but it is so absolutely small that it is not even worth calculating. Like it's not. So you end up getting in these large pockets of space that ended up kind of like coagulating together, sort of like all these rocks and particles and stuff like that, and then those end up spiraling. It's kind of like a snowball effect sort of thing, from what I understand. Of uh, kind of you end up creating these gaseous spirals and whatnot, and kind of dense. You get denser and denser and denser as things start getting closer and closer together. Like these particles start amassing on like one thing essentially, and yeah. So it kind of, as far as I know, which I guess we don't really know because cosmology is a little bit of an iffy subject for 100% certainty stuff. But uh, yeah, Big Bang Theory and stuff like that is what I've subscribed to. So time travel is complicated to say the least. I have not entirely decided for myself upon whether or not I think that time travel is possible in the sense that like a lot of movies and whatnot would say to you. Specifically, the idea of going back in time is something that I'm very hesitant to believe in, as cool as it would be, because the reason I say that is because there is technically possibility for time travel in the sense of like space-time dilations around black holes. So if you were to orbit a black hole for a while and manage to get out alive, obviously, but if you were to do that, like it's all like the Einstein general relativity and special relativity stuff with like the fact that gravity is so dense around black holes that space-time itself ends up getting a little bit distorted. So I can't, I don't have, I didn't expect to be asked about time travel, so I don't have an actual like idea of what the scale was for like how long you'd be around a black hole to how many years would actually pass. But I know I've read quite a few things about like, oh yeah, if you are rotating around this massive black hole and you manage to get out alive and stuff, and you're rotating for what seems like a couple weeks or something, and you manage to make it back to your planet, it's very possible that because of all that space-time dilation, you end up like the planet itself and like the people on it age by years and years and years, but you've only aged by like a few weeks based on all the stuff going around the black hole. So technically, through that, if you subscribe to that sort of scientific idea, then time travel is possible in a future bound sense. But I don't know what sort of scientific backing like the more Hollywood style time travel has with like going back in time, like Back to the Future and stuff like that. And I don't know, like an actual time machine sort of thing. I would love to see something like that start getting worked on at some point in my life because it would just be absolutely insane. But I don't entirely know how that's going to work. It's kind of, it eludes me. It's over my head. It's as far as that goes. But yeah, I do think future time travel is possible. I'll stand by that. I'll stand by that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would love to know what goes on and stuff like that. um, there's definitely, I mean, you kind of have to take everything with a grain of salt because around the 60s and whatnot, after Roswell and all that, there were a ton of alien sightings and stuff because people were trying to get like jump on the bandwagon of like getting attention through that and stuff. The question is whether or not any of that had any credence in like reality and stuff. And if it did, that would be absolutely insane that it's been like covered up this whole time. um, but like there are places, even if those things were kind of just like debunked and whatnot, there are definitely things that go on in these like military bases like Area 51 or Hangar 18 in Wright Pat Air Force Base is also another famous one. Um, which is actually not too far from my house. It's like a couple hours. Uh, but those types of things. There's definitely like secretive stuff going on. Obviously, it's military, so everything with the military is a little secretive. But there definitely could be some stuff. I don't want to put things in people's minds either way, but that definitely was something that I would like to know about, and I have always wanted to know about. So I would say that definitely inspired me to an extent. Okay. Well, first off, I would say the big thing is ask yourself, and ask everyone else how you can get involved in working in space. I think that is a very cool thing. That if you really are interested and want to do it, you don't have to be a genius. You just have to be really passionate about what you do, because the work ethic really takes over at a certain point. Uh, but so as far as things that are popping up in the actual work and whatnot, um, I would say, so if we're talking like first to fourth grade right now, so what is that, like 9-ish? Okay. So then like, yeah, like 10 years from now. So space mining is something that is slowly becoming more of a feasible thing. Um, there actually were some space mining companies that started and failed because they started way too early and they dumped money into stuff that was not going to happen a couple years ago. But I think that that's something that is very much going to be a big thing, mainly because one, it's super cool, the concept of landing on like asteroids and stuff, and having a robotic rover essentially like dig up minerals and whatnot and bring them back to Earth. Two, depending on what the minerals are that we're bringing back, I think the economic incentive is enough to kind of get a lot of like politicians and people behind it, because then it's not just like, oh, we're putting money into space and the only thing we're getting back is technology. This is like, okay, we can show you we're getting technology and you guys can get some money. And so I think that that's going to be something that kind of blows up slowly. Because it's definitely more of like a standard sort of business endeavor rather than just research based. Um, on top of that, I would say a lot of the further out planets and moons, like the stuff I'm talking about with Titan, this is essentially a preliminary thing that I'm working on right now. Like we don't plan to launch until 2036 at the earliest for this. So this would be like it takes about like 7 years to get out there, 7-8 years to get out there. So we're talking like a 16-year long mission for this that launches in 2036. So this is something that we're not going to be able to like analyze the soil of Titan until 2052 essentially. Um, so with stuff like that, obviously these aren't like super accurate dates or anything because it's all up in the air, and there's also not a lot of funding for it yet since it's kind of future based. But that's something that if stuff like that does happen, the kids watching this and whatnot might end up being the ones who actually like work on this and make it, you know? I don't think it's going to be something like going and living there. However, there are people there are a couple books. I can't remember what the book was, but someone actually just brought up in a meeting the other day that there's a book, and they also agree with the book that Titan is actually their favorite choice for kind of an Earth colony living on it rather than Mars, which is very interesting. I haven't looked too far into that, and I don't think that that's something that is going to happen soon, obviously, especially because it's really far out. So if we were talking about like the issues with having astronauts go on like a 2-year mission to Mars and stuff, we're talking like a 16-year mission to get to Titan, to get to Titan and back. So that's definitely going to be quite some time. But the reason that it's so cool, obviously, is it's very large. I don't know exactly the size. I can look it up really quickly. Titan or not. Okay, so it is a little under half the size of Earth, which is pretty large for a moon. And again, the fact that it's got an atmosphere, it's got a magnetosphere, which is something that Mars does not have, which I know is a reason why some people were saying that it might be more attractive to move there instead of Mars. So thick atmosphere, unlike Mars' really limited atmosphere, magnetosphere, which Mars doesn't have at all. The planet's very active, tectonic plates, volcanoes, huge mountain ranges, the methane ethane lakes. All of that is incredibly just interesting and stuff that we haven't seen a lot of places in the solar system. A lot of stuff is a little bit more inert and kind of silent per se. So Titan's an oddity in that regard. But on top of that, like I said, if there were something there that kind of, if some sort of life like started there, it would be so different from us that the research involved in that would be insane for biology in general. Just the idea that these life forms or something could live in and would most likely have, like, they would drink and think of water or think of methane and ethane the same way that we think of water, essentially. Because it doesn't matter what animal you are in this planet, whether you're a mammal or an insect or whatever, like you're drinking water, or you're a fish or a shark or something, and you're living in the water. Like, water is the core of all of the life on Earth, essentially. So, so the idea that life could start on another moon that has ethane and methane taking the place of water is very interesting for biology in general. So that's a couple of the reasons. So obviously, very similar to old Earth, possibility for life forms that use methane and ethane the same way that we use water, and the idea that potentially could be a better candidate for moving to rather than Mars. By define, do you just mean like what I like about working on them, or? Yeah, I would say that it's a pretty good bet that within like 20 years that some sort of space, like a legitimate moon base, starts to get built. Um, I there's no plans to build like a legitimate moon base right now. Right now, it's just kind of proof of concept, like I said, and kind of like getting a sustained presence. So getting used to like society having people on the moon constantly. But there's definitely possibility, and I think a lot of people at NASA and throughout the world want to kind of set up a moon base there eventually to have people stay for months at a time, which would be happening in probably like 10, 20 years. And I think that that's kind of the route that the moon's going to take, as well as kind of a pit stop as well. So once you get the moon base set up and stuff like that, I think a lot of deep space travel, because this is actually something that we've talked about as well. Deep space travel is probably going to end up uh, launching from the moon. So, reason for that, you don't have to punch through this dense atmosphere of Earth, as well as the much lower gravity. So there's essentially no atmosphere on the moon almost, and the gravity is much lower. So you can launch out with a essentially a very, very high excess velocity to get out super far, which you wouldn't be able to do if you launched from Earth with the same rocket. So kind of the idea of like whether you're building like a manufacturing plant sort of thing on the moon, or if you kind of have maybe like a refueling station on the moon and have a rocket sent up to the moon, kind of like park it there, refuel, do whatever, and then launch again from the moon so that you can actually get out further and faster. That way, we can probably exit the solar system a lot faster than Voyager 2 did, and kind of actually have some more interesting out of solar system research done. Uh, so actually, something that I really liked. So I'm sure you're familiar with like the Carl Sagan Cosmos show or whatever from years and years ago. Um, Neil deGrasse Tyson did one a few years, like 6 years ago, 5 years ago. That one was really interesting and cool to watch. Like every episode's like 45 minutes, and he goes through a bunch of different stuff and like um, history of like finding actual planets and stuff, as well as like stuff about space travel and the actual planets. That's really cool, and I don't think it's too high level for like younger kids or anything either. So, uh, Cosmos, I think it's just called Cosmos. You I've never watched the all of the Carl Sagan one, but the Cosmos: A Space Odyssey, which is the Neil deGrasse Tyson one, I have watched all of, and that's very good. I would recommend that. It's very interesting. Stay inspired is the big thing. Definitely don't let like any sort of, whether it's a person or a class you're doing bad in, or like if life starts really punching you in the face or something, like just keep moving forward, and don't let your passion for stuff like space, or whether it's even if it's something else, don't let your passions die out just because of like some rough point in life and whatnot. Obviously, you guys are younger, so it's probably not going to be a huge deal right now, but even so, different people go through different things, and like just stay inspired, watch movies, read books. Honestly, stuff like art as well can help you stay inspired. Like if you ever like to draw or write or anything like that, start writing some space stuff, start drawing some space stuff. Just get involved. Do what you can do. Uh, oh, now I see it. I love it. I've actually never played PUBG, but I am familiar with the term OP for overpowered. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Well, good. Goodbye, everyone. There's definitely a lot of you. I didn't expect so many. But thank you. Thank you for watching. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for having me on.
Yes. 1 second, just hold on. Mm.